So, how are you doing then?
I'm doing, quite well. Gotten some good work done today. Some on the
So,
website, some on other study-related things.
Yeah. So, firstly, let's talk about your background and how you came to so tell the audience how you came to do what you're doing.
Sure. Well, I am currently a student of biology, a bachelor at Aarhus University in Denmark. Now, I've been interested in biology for many years. I don't really know how long, as far as I can remember. And that's manifested itself in quite a lot of forms. It's included volunteer work and different projects when I was younger. Also ran some other blogs, ones which I'm perhaps slightly more embarrassed about now, but you still sometimes see people bringing them up. So I guess they reached a wider audience. And then through that, I built some contacts that I'm now using again for the blog. People who we've interviewed, people who have come in handy for other things.
Yeah, we've all been there. I've done silly blogs as well that I'm embarrassed about.
Yeah.
So then you're doing your bachelor's at our house, are you?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, let's discuss the megafaunal extinctions. Basically tell us basically tell us what the realm was like say 50,000 years ago and how it all went wrong.
That's a very broad question. That's kind of the entire scope of the website. So how much detail do you want there? Just a very general summary of the overall picture.
Yeah.
I guess if I had to summarize the situation back then, the easiest way to put it would be to contrast it with today. So today, of course, you have across the continent. First, I should probably say what that word megafauna means, because I'm not sure everybody watching this will know. It just means a big animal. That's what the name implies. On our website, we use the definition of any animal which weighs more than 40 kilos. That's an arbitrary definition. Some people raise that bar. It just means a big animal. What constitutes a big animal can depend on the context. If it's an island, 40 kilos might be a very big animal. If it's the Serengeti, maybe 40 kilos is not very big. But when we're talking about the megafauna, we tend to mean those pronouncedly big animals, stuff like bison, wild horses, aurochs, elephants. That would be Smilodon, saber-toothed cats. In the Australian context, maybe the marsupial lion, giant monitors. It just means a very large, impressive animal, which also typically has a very significant impact ecologically. So today, of course, when you think of big animals, what do you think of? You'll typically think of Africa, and maybe you'll also think of South Asia, perhaps India, Asian elephants, lions, that, although it's much more restricted in India than it is in Africa. You don't really tend to see those big Serengeti areas in India. But 50,000 years ago, or if we want to look at the last time the climate was comparable to today, we could say 100,000 years ago, you would have had these kinds of communities of large animals everywhere. That would have included, of course, Africa and South Asia. And back then you would have had Serengeti-like conditions in India, but you would also have had them in Europe, North Asia, North America, South America, Australia, everywhere except Antarctica. And even in Antarctica, of course, you would have had in the oceans much larger communities of whales and stuff than we have today. So you asked how it went wrong. I mean, again, very broad question, but I can give the general overview of the ideas. That is what happened to them. Why do we not have these animals today? And the two dominant competing, I guess you could call them the theses, would be either the climate-driven explanation. You've heard it before. Ice age ended, weather got hot, mammoth died because it's an ice age species. Or the human-dominated hypothesis, which is basically that people killed them all, or at least killed enough to destabilize the populations and cause the extinction. How those two relate to each other, which one is true, whether it's completely black and white, that's a very big, long debate. It's what we explore on the website, if people are interested in that. I definitely lean more on the camp of the what you could call anthropogenic causes, human causes. I think that's the overwhelming preponderance of the evidence. That is, if you didn't have humans, I don't think you would see these extinctions. But that doesn't mean that the particular time and place when an extinction did occur wasn't also due to an interplay of climate factors. So if you hadn't had the end of the Ice Age, maybe some species wouldn't have gone extinct until some 1,000 years later, for instance.
Yeah, yeah. I couldn't. I couldn't imagine hippos surviving and surviving in Northern Europe, even if there hadn't been any humans.
I mean, it depends on what you mean by surviving, right? Because they didn't survive. They retreated to the south.
Yeah, that's what I mean, yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's no reason to suspect they wouldn't have survived there, because if you look at the period when they went extinct, it's around 50,000 years ago. That's halfway through the last cold period. They'd already survived for 50,000 years during the cold period at that point. And the point when they disappeared doesn't really correspond to any particular cold period. It corresponds quite neatly to human settlement, but it doesn't correspond to any big shift in climate. So I don't really see how we can justify saying that was because of the climate, because again, there was no change and they'd already lasted for 50,000 years during the Ice Age. That's plenty of time for them to die out if habitat was the issue.
So basically the reason there's no hippos left in Europe is because of people.
And that's what I would contend. Not everyone would say that. In fact, a lot of people would say it was climate. You often hear that. I don't think that. Yep. Yeah. Sorry.
Now, what exactly is the consensus on these topics?
I would, if I had to be diplomatic, I would say the consensus is that there isn't a consensus. So you have competing camps, and those camps are quite large. You have respectable scientists in both camps, in the climate camp and the human camp.
Yeah.
And you will see, I don't know if I'm going to say convincing arguments for both sides, because I don't think the arguments for the climate side are very convincing, but you'll definitely see some quite forcibly expressed arguments for the climate side, and some very glossy books and large documentaries expressing that. But I think if you look at the most recent papers, the ones that actually address the factors, they tend to find a human cause. You'll still find new papers that propose a climatic cause, but they tend to arrive there by not actually looking at the relevant data points and not asking the relevant questions. So I don't really count their results for very much in that conversation.
Yeah, so linked to yeah, because I read your blog and I wonder how anyone can take the climatic thing seriously, and because there've been tons of fluctuations time and time again, but there'd never been any mass extinctions until humans showed up in Europe and in Australia and in North America and South America. And then you have the fact that if the climatic explanation was correct, why did the Australian megafauna die out 50,000 years ago, but not the New Zealand megafauna? And why did the Madagascar megafauna largely die out 2,000 years ago, but the megafauna in southern Africa remained fine?
Well, that is the question, isn't it? As for how people can still maintain the climate explanation, typically you maintain it by only looking at the local area. That's what I would say. So if you look at Australia alone, there is a big environmental shift around 50,000 years ago, which corresponds roughly with at least when the bulk of the extinction seemed to have taken place. If you're a climate advocate, you'll say that shift is what caused the extinctions. Now, is that we don't know why that climate shift even happened. Oh, can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, yeah.
Great. Can you see me?
Yeah, I can see you, yeah.
Good. What I was saying was that if you look only at the local regions, typically you can muster some sort of argument for climate. So for instance, if you look only at Australia and ignore New Zealand and the rest of the world, you can say there was a shift about 50,000 years ago. The continent dried. Before then, you had a relatively lush continent. Not completely, you still had the big arid interior, but you had much more rainforest and sort of wet forest than we have today. And then you had a shift in this period to the very dry woodland we know today, eucalyptus dominated. That didn't used to be how most of Australia looked. Now, the issue there, the issue with pinning that in the climate, is that that shift does not correspond to any big global shift in the weather system. It's kind of anomalous why that shift would have occurred 50,000 years ago. So the hypothesis that's also been mustered, which is the one I tend towards, is that this shift was because of the extinction of the megafauna. So we've just finished actually recording for our podcast an interview with a leading individual, a project leader from Rewilding Europe in Portugal. And in Portugal, they have a big issue with wildfires. And one of the main reasons they have this issue is because you have this removal of grazing livestock now, but also just grazing animals in general. And this leads to a buildup of leaf litter. You get shrubs closing in, you get leaf litter, it grows denser, denser, denser. And then if you have a dry climate, that makes it a tinderbox. This is basically what's been hypothesized as occurring in Australia. That when the big animals disappeared, the big grazing animals, the giant wombats, giant kangaroos, you had this sudden massive buildup of leaf litter and shrubbery, which then led to unprecedented wildfires that created this fire-dominated ecosystem we have today. So the issue is that if you're just looking at Australia, we're talking about thousands of years ago. So the margin of error for when these things occurred and what order they occurred in completely overlap. You can't say for certain. But it's possible that it went both ways. I would then add that if you look at the global picture, it becomes quite clear that these aren't just a bunch of random, unconnected climatic swings, because all of them individually would be unprecedented in Earth's history. So the odds of having 7 unconnected, massive climatic swings within 50,000 years, it's basically, it's zilch, it's nothing. It doesn't work.
Yeah, so there is one sort of, well, there's probably more grey areas, but an area that I've had on my mind lately, because I've been doing an essay in the human history of the area around that time, was the Sahara in the early Holocene, because it did have a large populations of a megafauna in the humid period, in around say 8,000 years ago, I think, was the apex of it. And then the narrative that I always hear is that the reason why they went away was because there was the Sahara dried up, and also humans had been in the area for thousands of years, so it doesn't make a lot of sense for humans to have caused it. Do you have any thoughts on the African Humid Period?
Well, I clearly don't think the humans were responsible for the drying of the savannah. That's clearly a weather phenomenon.
Yeah.
But also, unlike in Australia, the drying of the savannah was not unprecedented. That's been happening cyclically for a long time. It even happened within the Ice Age, within the last glaciation a few times.
Yeah.
So that's not surprising. However, in regards to what caused those extinctions, it's worth remembering that all of North Africa didn't dry out. You still had the Barbary Coast, which was and is relatively humid. It used to be forested until not too long ago. And so you had the survival into historical times of red deer, lions, bears, other animals elephants, rhinos in this region. So a question of why these things disappeared when they did, well, they didn't all disappear. Many of them survived until quite recently. But obviously, why aren't there currently giraffes in the interior Sahara? That's climate. It's the same reason why there aren't currently reindeer in Spain. That's also climate.
Yeah. And speaking of that, this was getting into something I was interested in, which was the you are going to write a blog post on the ancient North African fauna, but that's been postponed. And but one thing I was quite interested in was the idea Benoides and the possibility that it may be the same animal that the Egyptians called the Benu bird. Do you think that's a real possibility, or is it just a possibility?
Well, as you say, I've postponed the article for various reasons, so I haven't done all the research yet. It seems to be the case that the Bennu connection is relatively well accepted. That's, I mean, it's in the scientific name of the animal. Not that necessarily means much. I would need to do more digging to give any confident answer on that case in particular. But from what I've read thus far, it seems at least plausible. You have this big stork shown in the art, which doesn't appear to correspond either size-wise or coloration-wise to any extant stork. And then you have, from roughly the same region, evidence of a large extinct stork, or heron, actually. I think it is. It's not a stork, it's a heron. Heron. Yeah, it makes sense.
And also,
the dilemma. Go ahead.
No, sorry, go ahead. You go ahead.
I was just going to say that the dilemma with Egyptian art is that we have actually quite a lot of species, quote unquote species, that appear to be in Egyptian art that we don't know of. And actually a whole book has been written on this, which I will be drawing in when I eventually get around to that article. But that book is not ubiquitous, because when you're looking at art, you do have the issue of, is this a faithful life representation of an animal that no longer exists? Or is it just a stylized representation of an animal that does exist, but we don't draw it that way anymore? That's very difficult to test scientifically.
And on that note, let's discuss the pygmy elephant and the let's discuss the pygmy elephant in the room. So discuss the pygmy elephant, discuss its history, and discuss when we think it died out, when we think it died out and right, and what the and discuss the possibility there might be some historical references.
Yeah, so you're referring to the Tilos elephant in this case.
Yeah, Tilos, yeah.
Tilos is a small island in the Aegean Sea.
Yeah.
So I wrote an article on this back at the end of the summer. The essential gist of it, not the article, but the Tilos elephant specifically, which is one part of the article, is that we have two separate remains of dwarf elephants from Tilos, from a cave, which have been dated respectively to, I seem to remember, I don't have the article right here, but around 4,000 years ago and 7,000 years ago, respectively, which is way after the typical estimation of the extinction of the dwarf elephants in the Aegean. Now, I do caution quite a lot in that article because it is from one study, and I haven't seen it discussed anywhere else, but I haven't really seen it poo-pooed anywhere else either. People just haven't really addressed it. And the study itself is fine. It's respectable. It's from respectable authors from a scientific journal. And the reason why the find seems quite convincing is because, yes, it's from the same cave, but it's from different areas in the cave, and the bones have been dated directly, and they don't give the same date, right? Two different dates, both quite recent, from two different areas in the cave, dated directly. That's not a done deal, but it's quite convincing. So if we do have dwarf elephants in this island until about 4,000 years ago, that's interesting because, as you know, there have been other debates separate from this Telos conversation about the possible survival of dwarf elephants due to various pieces of artistic evidence, as well as reports of ivory being traded by Cretans, that being Minoans in this context.
Yeah. The one caveat is that we do find an awful lot of well, in the later Bronze Age, we do find an awful lot of hippopotamus ivory on Crete, but there's no evidence there are native dwarf hippos still there. But I think in the Requiem artwork, I think there's the depiction is of Cretans bringing in elephant tusks. So yeah,
that's Keftio, isn't that?
Yeah,
what they use? Yeah,
Yeah.
which might be Cretans. Well, I discussed the Requiem painting in the article, which if people want to see the painting, they can go to the article. I have an image of it up there. I'm not convinced that that animal is supposed to be a dwarf elephant. Nor are most people. Most people say that it's a stylized elephant. Whether it's a stylized baby with adult tusks or a stylized adult that's made small, that's debatable. I think if it is just a normal elephant, it's probably a juvenile with exaggerated tusks because it seems to be covered in brown fur. That's a trait of juvenile elephants. Adults don't have it. So, but again, if dwarf elephants did survive until 4,000 years ago, that's during the Minoan period, it seems very unlikely that the Minoans would not have been aware of this, since Telos is close to Crete and they were a big thalassocratic empire. The animal on the painting, brown fur, okay, that corresponds to a juvenile elephant. It might also correspond to a Telos dwarf elephant. We don't know. We don't know what they look like because they're extinct. So we can't really judge whether or not this matches the life appearance of an animal no one has ever seen.
Yeah.
It's possible. Not particularly likely, but possible is what I would say.
I'm interested in the possibility that that at least some ancient ivory in the eastern Mediterranean could have been of Telos origin, and this and until recently this was about as racky as my current art as the dissertation I was writing was going to get. But a few days ago, I discovered something completely unexpected, which was evidence which was evidence in, I think, Pliny the Younger and some other ancient Greek and Roman authors that they refer to people finding ivory buried in the ground and in marshes, and so it seems like though I'm cautious about a lot of the Adrian Mayer stuff, as you know, it does seem a real possibility that some ancient people were uncovering the ivory of mammoths and extinct elephants. So I thought that was interesting.
I think that's undeniable that they were. We have direct evidence of this. On the island of Samothrace, also in the Aegean, we know that the Greeks reported finding elephant bones there. They thought that they were leftovers from a Persian expedition. They weren't. They were dwarf elephant bones. But we have reports of that. That's clearly what they're talking about.
Yeah.
So they didn't identify the elephant correctly, and this goes back to the stories of people often talk about whether the finding of certain fossils inspired certain myths.
Yeah.
It seems to me very unlikely that the discovery of elephant bones would have inspired the myth of the Cyclops if Greeks elsewhere in the Aegean found elephant bones and correctly identified them as elephants, even though they're from an extinct taxa.
Yeah.
So that doesn't seem likely to me. It's interesting that they could tell they were elephants. But we have other cases too. The obvious one is Siberian bog ivory for mammoths there. In fact, the word mammoth comes from and a Tungusic language, Tungusic, I think it is originally, where the word meant not an animal, but a sort of mythical creature that burrowed into the ground and lived underground. And once in a while, people found their ivory. So people thought that the ivory came from these underground creatures. That's where the word comes from.
I did not know that. And what's interesting is that the Greco-Roman authors call mammoth ivory marsh ivory, and the author I was reading was saying that it's a real possibility that the Romans and the Greeks were getting this ivory from Siberia via the central Eurasian steppes.
Yeah, I mean, I can't testify to how plausible that trade connection seems. That's not my field, but we know that there's tons, literally tons of mammoth ivory in Siberia that's readily accessible and has been extracted for ages. I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe there's references to Chinese sources also getting ivory from Siberia. So that seems plausible.
And the real interesting possibility for me is there was that recent article a few weeks ago that established that, and there's evidence that mammoths were still alive on mainland Siberia as little as 4,000 years ago, and there could very, and in my view, I have to wonder if at some point in their early history the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians are getting ivory from populations that were still alive. It's a remote possibility, but it's still interesting.
It is interesting. I don't think that's very likely, because if you are an Egyptian, you could source incredibly expensive ivory from Siberia, but you could also just get it from an elephant in Egypt.
I mean, yeah,
or in remainder of North Africa.
Yeah, there's very little evidence elephants were found in Egypt in the historic period. They seem to live in pretty much every other place around them apart from Egypt. And
so within the Egyptian dominion, I should say, but not in Egypt itself.
Yeah. Like, we do have evidence that the Egyptians went to the Orontes Valley in Syria and hunted elephants there, as I discussed in my article for your blog. And but the only problem with what you were saying then is that the Romans apparently imported mammoth ivory despite the fact that they had elephants in North Africa as well. So
this is true. So perhaps they thought the ivory was of a better quality, although it says marsh ivory. That doesn't have to be from Siberia. It could be from somewhere else as well. Could be from the Baltics, perhaps.
Yeah, but to be fair, they only ever did it very rarely, according to the article I was reading.
Yeah, it's possible. Clearly, when the Romans are importing it, they're not getting it from live animals, because they refer to it as marsh ivory. They say themselves it's out of the marsh. The area that the mammoths are thought to have persisted in mainland Siberia until around 4,000 years ago, that area is an incredibly remote region, which is probably also why they survived there and nowhere else. So it seems unlikely that they would have been connected to the outside world by any trade networks, because it's precisely the absence of any large-scale human presence and trade presence that means they survived. So I doubt it, but you can't, might be, can't prove it.
Yeah, what was I going to say? So let's discuss on the note of mammoths, let's discuss the topic of recreation and rewilding. Do you have any strong thoughts on that the audience might want to hear?
Well, I'm certainly in favor of rewilding as a concept. Outspoken on that point. I think we have to be cautious with rewilding, not so much in regards to nature as some people are afraid of. I don't really see any danger in us releasing, say, bison in an area. If we want to remove them, we did that before. It's easy. Get a guy in a helicopter with a rifle. That's not the concern. The concern, from my perspective, is human. If you want to do large-scale landscape restoration, and if you want to include disruptive animals like large herbivores or carnivores in that project, that needs to work with the cooperation of the locals. Because realistically, there's only two ways you can do it without it. You can either try to go through with it without the locals being willing, in which case the animals will get shot anyway, or you can remove the locals, which is what people historically did. It's what they did in Yellowstone when they wanted to make that reserve. There used to be Amerindians living there. There aren't today. It's also what I've uncomfortably heard some rather extreme voices in the rewilding community effectively call for, even if they would never say it straight out. But that's definitely a fringe voice. The vast majority of rewilding organizations, including the main one in Europe, which is Rewilding Europe, work through locals to do these things. But with that caveat added, I'm very much in favor of it. I think rewilding is the only really effective way going forward, because it's clear that most present day practices, first of all, are too expensive. There's not a lot of money in conversation, and manually managing all of these reserves all the way through is incredibly expensive, with fencing, tractors, constant maintenance, equipment. Rewilding lets you put up one exterior fence. In some cases, sometimes that's not even needed. You bring back the animals, that's an initial expenditure, and then the ecosystem runs itself. That's the first side. The second side is that even with conservation practices we've seen thus far, that hasn't stopped most of these declines. So it's clear something new is needed, because continuing a practice that hasn't been working for a century is just insanity. It's just a waste of money. So I'm in favor.
What about some of the Rachio ideas? So there was one, I think someone in your country, he was arguing we should reintroduce elephants to Europe. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's, from an ecological perspective, completely sensible. From a human perspective, maybe less so.
Yeah.
I would be in favor of it if it could be made to work, but obviously I don't think you would ever get people releasing elephants into the Forest of Dean. That wouldn't go down well, nor the Black Forest for that sake, or anywhere in Denmark outside of a fenced enclosure.
Yeah.
What I would like to see, whether or not people go any further with it, is an experiment in a fenced enclosure, a monitoring experiment, seeing what impact Asian elephants would have on Danish, British, German nature within a reserve. That would be an interesting 5-year experiment.
Didn't they try to do that in your country?
They tried, sort of. They once did put out elephants in 2007 on a coastal nature reserve called Eskeslev Vesterlund, which is a big heath area by the coast. You got a bunch of heather and you got some juniper, and that's it. There's a forest, but it's fenced out. And they tried putting the elephants there and seeing if they could manage the reserve. And funnily enough, if you take an Asian elephant and you put it in an empty heath on a beach, it doesn't do too well. Who'd have thunk?
Yeah.
So that didn't last very long, and they didn't really learn anything. But that's mostly because the people who did that were perhaps not the right people.
Yeah, and on that note, what are your thoughts on those scientists who want to clone or recreate a woolly mammoth? And do you think that could ever be a thing? But of course, it wouldn't actually be a woolly mammoth. It'd just be a big just just be a big hairy elephant. But would you ever be in favour of something like that?
I think people need to remember is that mammoths are just big hairy elephants.
Yeah, no.
We talk about mammoths and mastodons and elephants and gomphotheres.
Yeah.
Mastodons were a separate thing. They were their own branch of the Proboscidean family tree. Proboscidea is the whole trunked animal, elephant, quote unquote, lineage.
Yeah.
Mammoths are not a separate thing. Mammoths are just a particular group of elephants. In fact, Asian elephants are closer to mammoths than they are to African elephants. So, but of course, you would not actually be bringing back the species, no. Because when people talk about cloning the mammoth, what they actually almost always mean. Now, I had my interview together with my co-host with Ben Novak some weeks ago, who is a leading scientist at a de-extinction organization, Revive and Restore. And they are also working in some capacity on a mammoth. But as we discussed there, you have many projects working on the mammoth. It's not just one group. Some of them are working on actual cloning. Most of them aren't. Most of them are working on gene engineering, which essentially means taking a living elephant and selectively replacing their genes with mammoth genes until you've achieved something that looks a bit like a mammoth and can function like a mammoth. If you do that, yeah, you're just getting a fuzzy Asian elephant. You're not getting an actual mammoth. You're not getting Mammuthus primigenius again. I guess the thing is, from an ecological perspective, nature doesn't care about the taxonomic status of this animal. Nature cares about its function. So I am completely in favor of it if it happens. I will believe it's going to happen when I see it having happened.
It's a little bit more plausible to just make a hairy elephant that doesn't have any mammoth in it, but you'll still need to adapt it to grass. So because mammoths were grassland animals, and they had the mammoth step.
Well, mammoths were incredibly adaptable. So you had them in grassland, you had them on heath, tundra, you had them in semi-forest areas. They can eat basically anything, very generalist species. But yeah, some of the genes, well, again, what they would be doing with this, it's not just making a fuzzy elephant. They're looking at the genome of the woolly mammoth, which we do have. They're identifying the differences between the mammoth and the Asian elephant genome, because they're quite similar. Obviously, they're close relatives. And then having found those differences, they are selectively porting them over while the rest of the genome remains Asian elephant. So among those genes would necessarily be stuff like diet, dentition, yes. Otherwise, they can't survive in the north.
Yeah.
But I'm not a geneticist.
I'm going to turn the light on. That's better. So, do you think it'll ever be possible to create something like a great auk, or even making or even one of the more interesting one that is modifying chickens to make them more like dinosaurs. What are your thoughts on stuff like that?
So these are two different questions, because with an auk, we're talking about actual cloning.
Yeah.
The mammoth, there was not cloning. With the auk, you also hear about the moa sometimes.
Yeah.
We're talking about actual cloning, finding genetic material from these animals and doing that. I don't know. I don't know what the state of the research is there. I don't think too much has been done with the auk. I'll say that intuitively, the extinction of the great auk was very recent. So it seems plausible, perhaps, that you would have surviving genetic material. But that being said, at present, we don't know how to clone dead cells.
Yeah.
So we have seen living clones, including one instance of a extinct species being cloned, the Pyrenean ibex. It survived for 5 minutes and then died. But in every case of cloning today, we've had living cells cryogenically preserved that have then been used to produce a new animal. Even with the great auk, which is only a couple centuries ago, we don't have that. So is that insurmountable? Maybe not in 20, 30 years. At present, probably is. As for the dinosaur thing, I mean, that's totally different, right? Because we're not even working towards any one species. We're just generally trying to tweak certain genes to reactivate certain dinosaur features. So do I think that can be done? Maybe. Sure. There's lots of sort of hidden, dead, quote unquote, genes lurking in the genome of living animals. Maybe if you tweak enough of them, you'll get a bird with a tail. Or maybe you'll just get a really deformed bird. That's possible too. I mean, people have already tweaked chicken embryos so that they develop toothed snouts. Those embryos don't survive, they don't go to term, but they have done it, and you can see sort of x-rays of these birds with toothy snouts instead of beaks. So who knows? Not me.
Yeah, I personally don't think we shouldn't recreate anything that could potentially damage modern day ecosystems, because that would be like when we introduced American mink to England, and it caused havoc.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I don't really think that's a danger. To be frank, it's incredibly unlikely that we'll ever be able to clone anything outside of a few very recently extinct species.
Yeah.
So even stuff like the saber-toothed cat, we can't clone that because we have no living analog. So with the mammoth, again, they're not talking about cloning. They're talking about taking a surviving very close relative, which isn't just genetically close, but it also morphologically is very similar to the mammoth, and making a few substitutions. You can't do that if you don't have a surviving analog.
Yeah.
So with a saber-toothed cat or a giant ground sloth, what are you going to modify? You can't. People might say a tiger because they call them saber-toothed tigers, but that's a misnomer. They're not actually very closely related at all. So you just can't do that. So with a dinosaur chicken, I would be surprised if they got that egg to hatch. I wouldn't be too worried about whether they're going to become the next cane toads. If they can get the thing to survive more than 2 weeks, that would be a big success.
Yeah. And also because we've got some time still, what is just a personal question, what continent do you think had the best megafauna?
Well, I can start by giving you the scientific answer and saying that the continent which had the most megafauna, can you guess which one it was?
North America.
South America.
Ah.
South America had the greatest biomass of megafauna, just raw density of it, but it was also the most species diverse one. I think the biomass at the max was about twice what it is in Africa today. So there was an incredibly large quantity of megafauna there. As for which continent had the best megafauna, I do really like the Americas. They had very, very interesting faunas. I think I might have to say South America also, because you just had this perfectly fleshed out ecosystem, right? You had everything. You had saber-toothed cats, you had elephants, you had peculiar giant ground sloths, you had giant armadillos the size of cars, right? You had everything. You had weird groups that survived for millions of years, completely separate from everything else, like the litopterns, like Macrochania, which have no analogs anywhere else. And you had all of these peculiar, diverse creatures that are just incomparable. So I think that's probably the most interesting continent. Also because you had a combination of the old world and the new. You had horses, you had bears, you had cave lions, perhaps in the southern part, that's uncertain. And then you also had these unique species. Australia would also be really interesting because everything in Australia was weird. Australia was a continent where the largest herbivores were giant wombats, and all of the large predators except 2 were giant reptiles. And even of the large predators that were mammals, the biggest mammalian predator was also a giant predator, a wombat. It's just a very weird continent. I would have loved to see that.
The marsupial lion.
Yes, Thylacoleo. It is basically just a wombat with sharp teeth.
Yeah.
But despite being a wombat, it is estimated, the strongest bite force of any mammal.
Yeah, I was just about to say that, and it's a real shame because the Australian megafauna is never going to come back. There'll never be any recreation of that.
No.
And,
Maybe they'll get the thylacine. Maybe. At least that's, again, very recent. But even there, I don't know. Wouldn't count on it.
yeah, and what else? And a common idea linked to Australia and South America and also Africa in particular would be the idea that it's promoted by organisations like Survival International, where the idea that native indigenous people they tend to look after the land right well, and apparently that whenever they're taken off the land, which we were talking about earlier, the biodiversity sometimes declines. And I was wondering, firstly, what are your thoughts on this idea, and if it's got any merit or not? And secondly, how do you think if it has and also if it has any merit, why do humans treat nature better after thousands of years than they did when they first arrived in these areas?
I certainly won't contest that indigenous people tend to have been better at managing their areas and more harmonious with nature than the Europeans were. But that's, in and of itself, that's a bit like saying that wildfires are better at preserving forest than napalm. Like it doesn't. Yeah. It's a very what we would call sort of a bjørnekompliment in Danish. Like it's a compliment that betrays sort of a snide insult. Yeah. So, but as for how sustainable indigenous peoples actually were, for one thing, that depends on the people you're talking about, right? There's no such thing as one indigenous culture. Yeah. In general, it is what you alluded to, that after a certain period, people enter into some semblance of a balance with their environment. But by the time that happens, they've typically wiped out large amounts of that environment to begin with, right? So it's true that by the time Europeans arrived to North America, the American Indians were no longer actively wiping out the bison. The bison were not heading towards extinction. That's correct. Yeah. However, they got to that point by wiping out basically every single other large animal in North America except the bison. Even some of the other surviving animals there, like the elk or the moose as they call it, is a recent colonist from Eurasia. The native stag moose got wiped out by the first Native Americans. So again, it's this sort of balance thing where on the one hand, it's true, they did find a certain balance after a while, but on the other hand, they found that balance again in the same way that a guy smashing up a house might eventually find a balance when he hits something that doesn't break. Partially that's because the Native Americans used the bison. So we like to think of them as just passive stewards of the land, but that's not really the situation here. The bison were obviously incredibly important to Native Americans, and that meant they actively modified the landscape to accommodate the bison. They were essentially engaging in a sort of what you might call passive farming, which we've seen elsewhere too, using wildfires, sort of lighting fires to create more habitat. So it's not just that they were not wiping them out. They were themselves deliberately transforming the continent to accommodate this animal, which may coincidentally have recreated some of the processes of the original savanna ecosystem, just like how wood pastures in Europe unintentionally recreated some of the original mosaic landscape, in which case they probably did help compared to if they had then disappeared. But again, the only reason they were even necessary is because they had already wiped out the animals that would otherwise have been fulfilling the function they had now stepped in to fulfill. So it's the same thing in Europe, where if you take farmers off the land and you just leave it, often the land will get overgrown and you'll see a decline in species diversity. But that's only because this land is not able to manage itself because the crucial keystone species have been wiped out by the ancestors of those farmers.
Yeah, and so basically the only reason they were preserving bison was for pragmatic reasons, sort of.
What? No, I mean they had spiritual reasons too,
Oh.
right? They didn't want them to go extinct, but it's not like any of these people wanted the first animals to go extinct either. I mean, the first, by and large, in fact, in pretty much every instance, humans, early hunters didn't understand what they were doing to these populations. And you still see this. Studies have been done on the attitudes of modern hunter-gatherers or recent ones. And when they were confronted with local declines in species or local extinctions, they almost always rationalized it as the animals just going elsewhere, or the great lord of the animals holding them back to punish them in some way. And then if they relented, if they changed their ways, the animals would be let back out, right? So they didn't understand what they were doing to these populations. So it's not like the first Americans or Europeans or the initial Maori in New Zealand were just callous and didn't care at all about the environment. They simply didn't realize what they would do. And by the time they did realize that, it's mostly because they had learned through trial and error. But that trial and error consisted in wiping out 90% of all the life in these areas, 90% of the big animals. So that's part of the reason they learned. They did genuinely learn. It's just that the process of learning was incredibly destructive.
Yeah. But there, and also, there's a. Why do you think it is that that North and South America lost so much megafauna when compared to Afro-Eurasia?
The typical answer to that question is the coevolution hypothesis, which is the idea that in especially Africa, but also to a lesser degree, the rest of Eurasia or Afro-Eurasia, humans had co-evolved with the species of megafauna, which means they had a degree of built-in protection through behavior that megafauna in other areas didn't have. They knew how to respond around humans, how to flee, when to hide, how to act. This was most pronounced in Africa, which is also why the extinctions are least pronounced there. But in other parts of Afro-Eurasia, in Asia and Europe, you had non-human hominids that co-evolved with them. And so you got a lesser degree of the same mechanism. So in Europe, we clearly have evidence of Neanderthals exploiting their environment, which also seems to map quite well on, I've seen studies that show that if you look at how long hominids have been in a region, and you contrast that with how severe the extinctions were in that region, there's a pretty direct correlation where the extinctions were least severe in Africa, where humans have been for longest. The second to least hard-hit area was South Asia, where they've been second to longest. The third least hard-hit area was Europe, where they had been for about 400,000 years, a million years. And then when you get to the rest of the world where you'd never had any, the extinctions almost kill everything.
What puzzles me though is why did horses, they died out in North and South America, but why did they survive in Europe? Not in Europe, in North Asia.
Oh, they did also survive in Europe until historical times. Yeah. I think the answer to that is that adaptation happens on a local level. It happens population by population. So why did Eurasian, I mean, you have other cases of this too. Wolves in Eurasia survived, but the North American wolves didn't. All the wolves in North America today were a recent replacement. Oh. Same with moose. And wapiti. They also came over from Eurasia after the American counterparts got wiped. Yeah. Why did they survive? It's probably because those local populations in Europe and Asia had co-evolved with humans, so they had behavioral adaptations that let them survive, whereas the ones in America didn't. And then they were eventually, in some cases, repopulated by populations from Eurasia, from the West, that did have these adaptations.
So basically, North American moose and horses and wolves were less used to people.
They were naive.
Yeah. And since you mentioned Neanderthals, can you touch on the question of what do you think it's likely that that Homo sapiens killed them off, and how exactly did they do it?
I think, first of all, yes, I do think that. I don't think I've really seen anyone claim otherwise. I've seen some people claim it was a disease people brought with them. That strikes me as unlikely, but maybe. I've seen other people claim that it was some climatic event at the same time that weakened them. But the majority opinion has always been, as far as I can tell, that humans did them in and replaced them. That's very clear, especially now. We have studies that show that you can track through archaeological evidence the human colonization of Europe region by region. It happened from the east to the west. And you see that Neanderthal decline and disappearance correspond region by region to the steps of human colonization. So humans reach the Balkans first, Neanderthals vanish from the Balkans first. They reach Italy second, Neanderthals vanish from Italy second. So it's very clear that that's what happened. As to how it happened, famously, Europeans and some other populations have a very small percentage of Neanderthal ancestry. So to some degree, probably they were simply bred out of existence. But I don't think that's the main event. I think mostly our ancestors just killed them. I mean, if you look at how humans treat each other, I really don't think it's a stretch to think that when humans discovered this other species that was really like us, just enough to be disturbing, but not quite like us, I don't think it's a stretch to say they just killed them.
Yeah.
We know that the first, well, we don't know, but we've estimated, studies have come to say that the first human populations in Europe were more than 10 times as large as the preceding Neanderthal populations. So we had a massive demographic advantage. We just flattened them.
And that reminds me of a I think there's something like that in the Silmarillion, where I think when the elves first encountered the petty dwarves, and
the petty dwarves, memes people,
they thought they thought they were some sort of weird animal, so they hunted them and killed them. So yeah, that's and I think that sounds a bit like what might have happened when humans first met Neanderthals.
Well, I think that's probably what happened on Flores with the Flores hobbits, perhaps. Yeah. Neanderthals were huge and bulky, right? They looked even more intimidating than a grown human. So I don't think they necessarily wouldn't have recognized them as people per se. They also wore clothes. I think it's more that the uncanny valley effect would have been really, really bad right there. Yeah. And so you would have had the pre-existing sort of human resistance to outgroups amplified much more by this group, which maybe couldn't even talk in the way that we considered. Probably that would have provoked a rather violent reaction. We know that much less than that in recent history has provoked comparable genocidal reactions. So, yeah. Although of course, I don't think the first humans tried to genocide the Neanderthals. I just think that there was conflict on a region by region scale, which ultimately wiped them out.
Would it be something similar to what happened to the maybe was the Tasmanian was what happened to the Tasmanians deliberate? Not sure.
I mean, I'm sure it was to some degree probably deliberate, but in many cases it was a mixture, right? In many cases, if you look at the Americas, the Europeans showed up with diseases they weren't trying to bring. Then they saw what happened and how effective a weapon it was, and then eventually they began purposefully using it. But by then, most of the damage had already been done unintentionally. I don't think disease was a big factor here. First of all, because disease doesn't tend to spread very effectively through small populations like these scattered bands of Neanderthals. And secondly, because if you look at how disease typically spreads in comparable situations like the Americas, the disease spreads ahead of the colonization event. So the European brought diseases reached the west of the US before the Europeans did. Whereas if you look at Europe, the collapse of Neanderthal populations corresponds to human settlement. It doesn't run ahead of it. So I don't think it's a disease. I think it's, if you went down there on the ground, you would see people bashing each other's heads in.
And also, I've heard there's evidence that that there was evidence. I think in it was in I think Ross Barnett's book, The Missing Links. There's evidence that humans actually killed and ate Neanderthals.
I'm not familiar with this evidence. I'm going to be reading that book soon for reasons that will become apparent eventually. But I mean, that wouldn't surprise me. Humans eat each other.
Yeah.
So why wouldn't they eat Neanderthals?
Sure, Neanderthals might have returned the favour as well.
Oh, sure. I mean, that seems almost guaranteed to me that they would have done that.
Yeah.
Like cannibalism was very, very common in human history.
Yeah, and also there's about 3 more questions I have. Firstly, what other alongside human and climatic causes, what other possible explanations have been given, and how plausible do you think they are?
Other ones I've heard include, one of them includes an asteroid hypothesis.
Yeah.
It's been said that the Younger Dryas was due to a bolide impact. Now that might actually be true, maybe. It doesn't seem too implausible to me. The only problem is that basically none of the extinction events correlate with Younger Dryas, so it doesn't really matter. We can see in Eurasia that most of the Ice Age fauna had begun to decline by the Bulling-Ellerod interstadial, which was 2,000 years before that. In South America, they don't disappear until the early Holocene. In South Europe and Australia, they vanished tens of thousands of years earlier. It's only really in North America that you have a rough correlation with that point. So maybe there was an asteroid, but it doesn't matter. Unless you want to hypothesize that like 7 different asteroids hit Earth region by region over a span of 50,000 years ago, but that doesn't seem very plausible. Another idea I've heard is that humans brought a contagion with them that wiped out all the megafauna. That doesn't really need to be, like, there's no reason to even consider that. The idea that humans had a contagion that somehow spread from mammals to reptiles to birds, but only affected large animals and not the small ones, it's not worth mentioning. Those are the main 2 ones I've really heard. It's hard to even envision what else it could be. Either it was, I've heard that one too. I have heard that one too. I guess the bolide impact kind of slides into that category.
Yeah.
But if you don't have it be humans or the climate or some extraterrestrial factor or disease, what other options are there, right?
Not much.
A black hole.
Yeah. And finally, what's the way forward with your blog, and what have you got planned for it?
Well, I won't make any big promises from the far future because that's always dangerous. We have plans, but we don't know when or how we'll execute them. So that'll have to wait and see. As for the near future, we're going to continue the podcast, of course. We have a string of interviews that are going to come out. We just recorded one a few days ago. We have some others in the backlog, and we have some more scheduled. Some of them are quite interesting. I'm quite excited about some of them to release. So that's one thing. As for the blog itself, it's clear now, I think, that we've been re-releasing the Europe series, Europe 1 and Europe 2, in anticipation to the 3rd installment of Europe, which will be coming out at the end of the month. So that's the thing to look forward to for the immediate future. That'll be the next article. In December, of course, well, we're going to be continuing the content. I can give a little spoiler and say that there's going to be content related. I mentioned the Flores people before, Homo floresiensis, the hobbits. Yes. Carry that thought. That's going to be relevant.
we should rename them the don't call them the hobbits and call them the petty dwarves.
Homo mimiensis, yes.
Yeah. And also, just so the audience knows, where can they find you or your blog on internet?
Mm-hmm. So they can find us at theextinctions.com,
yeah.
Spelled just like that. We are also on Twitter. You can find a link to the Twitter on the website, but otherwise our Twitter handle is also The Extinctions.
Yeah.
The podcast can be found on Spotify and Apple podcasts. You can search for it there, or you can find a link from the website. I think that's about all the facets. We also have a presence on Facebook, if people are interested in that.
And one last thing, what nature documentary what nature documentary portrays the Pleistocene and Megafauna in the best way, do you think?
I mean, I don't really know
that
I can think of any good documentary on it, to be honest. I mean, if you want to just see the Pleistocene megafauna, probably Walking with Beasts is one of the at least one of the most well produced in terms of production values documentaries, but it does not come to the same conclusions that I came to today here. I'm afraid I can't really give any recommendations for excellent Pleistocene documentaries, and people are going to have to make some new ones.
The science goes, you're talking about.
Well, even in terms of production values, I can only really think of Walking with Beasts. Yeah. There's a couple other ones, but they don't come to the same level, and I can't really think of any new ones with sort of big modern technology on the subject.
There's monsters. We met, which doesn't shy away from the human cause extinction.
Well, I might have to watch that one then.
Yeah.
There's also Prehistoric Park, which is not a documentary, but it does touch on the South American and the European extinctions, although again, doesn't really discuss the causal factors.
Well, for the mammoths, it does, but not really for the South American megafauna. In fact, they actually no people there at all.
But aren't there forest rakids in that episode? Terrorbirds.
Well, yeah, and
so if there's terrorbirds, that means it takes place in the early Pleistocene.
Well, I think the first bit was set in the early Pleistocene, and the second bit was set in the early Holocene, but they get the reasons wrong for it.
See, clearly I need to rewatch that again because I'm misremembering it.
Yeah. Right then, and on that note, thank you for coming on. I will stop recording now, and hopefully we can have you back again.
Well, thanks so much for having me.